Who is my neighbour? That is the question posed by the expert in the law to Jesus. And it's a question maybe we should be asking ourselves today, because we are asked now to care for our neighbours in ways that we maybe haven't before. And for some, the question might be, well, who is my neighbour? Jesus uses a technique which many rabbis did in those days in answering the question. He tells a story, he tells a parable. And the way he does it was very clever. And let me tell you how. Imagine if I said to you, an Englishman, an Irishman and a Scotsman go into a pub. Most of you will know exactly what I'm doing. I'm telling a joke. And in this case, there would be a scenario, there'd be a situation, and the Englishman, the Irishman, the Scotsman would react to that situation in a different way. And the idea was that one of them would get it totally wrong, and that would be the joke. When Jesus tells this parable, he does something similar. He uses three people, three examples. And the challenge for the experts in the law, and I suppose the challenge for us who are reading the story or listening to it, is to ask ourselves, which of these three should I follow the example of? Which of these three does the right thing? So Jesus sets the scene. There's a man left for dead on the floor, on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. We don't know anything about the man except that he's been beaten and left half dead. The first person to come down that road is a priest. And when he sees the man on the floor, he crosses onto the other side and continues his journey. And this is very significant. I think and I believe that the expert in the law is actually a Pharisee, a teacher of the law, someone who knew the law of Moses like the back of his hand, who made sure that people kept to the law of Moses. Now the thing about the Pharisees, generally they did not get on with the priests who worked in the temple. And even though they were both Jews, it's a bit like comparing, say, Liverpool fans and Manchester United fans. They might be both football fans, but they come from very different parts. And for the Pharisees and for the priests, even though they were both Jews, they would have different views, different traditions, different ways, different beliefs of how to live out that Jewish faith. And so the fact that the priest crosses the road and walks down the other side would have pleased the Pharisee. Because the Pharisee would be thinking, well, that's what priests do, don't they? That's exactly why I don't really get on with them. Second person that comes down is a Levite. And again, these are people who work in the temple alongside the priests. And again, the fact that the Levite, when he sees the man on the floor, steps on the other side of the road and continues his journey, would again have pleased the Pharisee. Well, because that's what Levites are like, aren't they? They're all the same in the temple. At this point, the Pharisee will be thinking, the next person down the road has to be a Pharisee. And surely the Pharisee will do the right thing, and I can relate to that Pharisee, and Jesus will tell me and the world, actually, that we are doing the right things. Can't imagine any surprise when actually the third person coming down the road is a Samaritan. Now, if Pharisees and people in the temple don't get on with each other, the one thing they can agree on is that they do not associate with Samaritans. Samaritans were definitely not part of the crowd. They did not belong. They were very much on the other side and should never be spoken to, come into contact with, come into the presence of. And the fact that Jesus uses the Samaritan as the third person, and not only as the third person, but the one who cares for the beaten man's wounds, puts him on his donkey, takes him to the inn, pays for him to be cared for, comes back and pays any extra expense, would have horrified the Pharisee. And so when Jesus then asks the question of the teacher of the law, which of these acted like a neighbour towards the man, the Pharisee couldn't even say the word Samaritan. All he could say was the one who showed care, the one who cared for him. What Jesus has done there is put the teacher of the law in an impossible position. The idea for the teacher was to, or the expert was to look at the examples of these people and say, which of these do I relate to? Now, he was not going to relate to either the priest or the Levites. Not only didn't they get on, but actually they did the wrong thing. And the one thing he never wanted to do was to associate himself with a Samaritan. He couldn't even say the word Samaritan. But there was one other character left in the story that we hadn't really thought about. And that was the man on the floor left half for dead. You see, in asking the question, the expert of the law was basically saying to Jesus, who can I consider as my neighbour? Where do I draw the line? At what point can I say that you're in and you're out, that you belong and you don't, that you can be my neighbour but you can't? Where's the limit to where I can place my barrier? But Jesus flips it. He actually says to the teacher or the expert on the law, who was the one that was a neighbour to the man left for dead? In other words, if you were the man on the floor, left half for dead, who would you want to be a neighbour to you? And of course the answer is very simple. Anybody who can give me help. Anybody who can give me that care. Anybody who in my moment of need can actually come and help me. And of course the experts of the law, all he can say was, well, which one of those was acting like a neighbour towards this man? It was the one who cared. I can't say Samaritan, but it's the one who cared. And Jesus says to the experts, you go and do likewise. In other words, it's not for you to decide who is your neighbour and who isn't. As far as that man on the floor was concerned, anybody and everybody was his neighbour. Anybody who was willing to give help, anybody who was willing to care was his neighbour. And Jesus said to the expert, you be the same. Don't make distinctions, don't draw a line, don't create a barrier, don't decide who's in or who's out. Everybody and anybody is your neighbour. Go and do likewise.